So for our last session today, we're going to dig into automation. So automation has been thrown around multiple sessions, such a powerful tool. Gabe talked about it in the product keynote earlier. And so we're going to actually dig into a step-by-step guide, a deep dive into how automation has helped real nonprofits, real ministries. I've got Carly and Rachel here from Virtuous, two of my friends and colleagues. Behind me, again, kind of awkwardly, there's Justin from one of our customers, Jewish Voice Ministries. And so without further ado, we're going to dig into automation. So take it away.
Thank you, Jason. And now it's just the three of us. So we figured we'll kind of start off with just a little bit of what can you automate? What are the possibilities that exist for it? Because I think just even discussing that alone can really surprise people, which almost sounds like a BuzzFeed article. This might surprise you. But I think it really, truly does. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the possibilities that exist for automation. And then, of course, I'll turn it over to the fabulous experts who actually did this and actually saw results and had a whole process to get into it. And I think that can be really valuable because now we can kind of get in the head of where do we even begin with this? How did they do it? What can I take away from this? So let's talk a little bit about some of the possibilities of automation here. I'll get the slide deck going. Perfect. Whoop, let's back that up a little bit. All right, so I did say, we'll talk a little bit about some possibilities of what to automate. So first, communications. And I leave that to be very vague because lots of communications can be automated. We can automate email outreach, phone outreach, all kinds of different things, or even just prompting people to make those personal touches. I know that can be a really big concern with automation, thinking, oh, we're just letting robots do it all. And then this becomes very robotic and very impersonal. But it's not meant to be that way. We do have those opportunities that exist. So essentially, we can set these kind of time markers to say, okay, after a certain thing has happened, perhaps a donor makes their first gift, then that's when we remind someone to say, hey, let's reach out to this donor and make a very personal phone call. Second thing, another one that I think can really surprise people is internal administrative tasks. So a lot of automation follows this if this, then that principle, right? If this thing happens, then I want this set of events to happen. All right, I see there's some comments in here about really strong feedback. We'll be working on that. So in terms of other administrative tasks, it's really just managing data in the database. There are lots of ways you can do it. And what's really nice about some of these possibilities is we'll actually see these examples live. Another one can be just, again, in line with communications, data gathering. Again, someone does a thing. Let's get a little more information about that thing. But these are just a few different ideas that exist for automation. There's plenty more you can do with it. People can get really creative about it. And I think there are a lot of opportunities outside of what's here, but I think these are probably things that I'm most excited about. And so without further ado, we'll highlight a couple of these in a couple actual samples. So first, we'll look at an example of internal data management. So how do certain events impact contact preferences, right? Which is kind of this background step to ensure that we have responsive communications that are going to the right people at the right time. And then we'll talk a little bit about donor gratitude. So how do you communicate with recurring donors after certain periods of time? What does that look like? So again, this is when I'll turn this over to the fabulous experts we have here. We'll start with internal data management and managing contact preferences. So there's a lot going on this screen. And Justin, I'm going to actually start asking you some of this, or sorry, Carly, can you briefly walk us through the flow of this?
Yep. So like she just said, there's a lot on the screen. This is because what you're seeing is multiple automations that have to do with administrative tasks. But what we're going to pay attention to is the first automation on the left. So this is an example of an automation where you create a tag. And if you don't have Virtuous, a tag is basically just a flag on an account so you can identify a contact record for something specific. So in this case, we created a tag for deceased that then created multiple other tags or tasks. So that's just one example, but you could use that in a multiple of ways. If you wanted to tag someone as a volunteer and then have multiple tasks or steps after that. So here we created the tag for deceased, and then there's all sorts of tasks that go along with that. So like making sure that they don't get mail, making sure they don't get emails, making sure they don't get phone calls, etc. Instead of doing those manually, those all happen automatically.
That's awesome. So, there's a lot going on here, a lot of actions that are happening. So I'm curious to know, how did you identify the steps or actions you wanted to take? Kind of taking this back to the if this, then that principle. So how do you know, like, who should have these tags added, like very specifically?
Yeah, so we really walked through like what manual processes are we doing that we could remove, and how is this also going to affect other constituents or vendors. So in this case, like a deceased flag does affect vendors, someone who's doing our direct mail. So we have a specific process that they use, and then we also have an internal process. So then we had to kind of walk through and say, okay, what are we doing manually, and how can we convert that automatically for us, and as well, in this case, for vendors.
All right, awesome. So I have to ask, and you mentioned that like there's a manual component to this, thinking about what you had to do manually to do this. So if this workflow didn't exist, what would you have had to do to manage this and manage all these steps and manage all these different indicators of contact preferences?
Yeah, a lot of manual Excel checklists, basically. And we're talking about one example here, but think about this in terms of like multiplying all of your manual work for other automations. This is just one, but a checklist of when someone is deceased, here's all the things we have to do. We have to tag no direct mail. We have to make sure our vendor knows to not include them in their select. We have to tag no email, all the different things that come with that. And the other piece about creating this automation is it allowed our vendors to tag automatically also. So instead of them just saying to us, sending an email, hey, we received a mail piece that came back and said, this no longer exists, and then we have to manually tag it, they could automatically tag it and trigger the automation too. So it really reduced time on our side and our vendor side.
Amazing. And right, that seems like a win-win on both sides. It's good for the vendor, it's good for you guys. And then I imagine in turn, it's great for your supporter set, right? Because now it's happening a little more automatically, as the name automation might suggest. So I imagine this is just a win everywhere. And, having this automation put together, even though it's not outward facing,
right,
but it does impact those outward facing communications. So I think that's really, truly impactful. And there are a lot of things that we don't consider on the back end of things, right? No one knows that like, hey, if we didn't have this, we have to shave down these contact lists to make this happen. And that can take a little bit of time if you don't have these processes in place.
Right.
So I think that's just really fascinating. Is there anything more you two would like to share about this?
Yeah, I would say on this one, I think so many times people think about automation as like marketing. Mm-hmm. Like how can we automate emails, mail, etc. But in this case, you're actually automating the back end tasks that you're doing. So don't just like, maybe the biggest impact is automating your back end tasks before you even automate any marketing, right, because it's going to save time so you can even think about marketing. So I would just say there's so much that automation can do on the administrative side that maybe you're not even thinking about.
I think that's really impactful. And I think just, again, looking at that big picture of everything, not just how do we send out an email, what do we say in that email, but like, who do we send that email to? And how do we make sure that the right people are getting this email? I think that's really important, and just, wider picture of communications in general. And so again, kind of tying this back to, there's this vague need for communications for automation, but that comes with not a lot of steps. And I don't say that because automation has to be that complicated, but because it has that much impact and that much potential. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely.
Actually, one thing I would like to point out for that automation is when you think automation, you think, oh, okay, I have to set up all these criteria and it's going to be running all the time. And how do I know what it's doing and all this? In this case, it's just triggered by a single tag that's put on by one of your users, either your data team or a partner services team. And so it's very controllable as far as when it triggers. And so you have all that control over it. You don't have to do anything big and fancy And you can do that for emails, you can do that for postcards, you can do that for other things where instead of having your person like hand write out a note card and send it off, they just throw a tag on the account and it triggers the letters on demand to send. And so then you're saving time, but you're still getting the same effect.
Right. And I think that just adds to the internal communication that's happening, right? Helping team members communicate to the system, which is also kind of you two as well. But like, I think having team members say like, I'm going to add this tag and I know something's going to happen because we have systems in place to help set that up. Yeah. And then that helps us communicate to our vendor. Vendor communicates to us. We communicate to donors, right? This kind of web of communication becomes so much more sophisticated as a result of, I don't want to say simple because it's basic or easy, but simple because it's a few steps and it's a few actions. But simple can mean impactful as well. So I think that's just really awesome, right? And I really love this comment we got in the chat here. Impact. Automation allows nonprofits to be way more effective by streamlining essential processes. That is the nature of this particular workflow that we're talking about in here. And why I really thought it was important to highlight this and highlight like how this has impacted all of us and impacted our donors and things like that. So we'll move on to the next slide because we talked a little bit about internal data management. And then Carly, you mentioned talking a little bit about before you even start working on those communications, those outreach messages, let's start, we can start here. And then we can start to think about, okay, like what does a flow look like for actually sending out those messages? Yep. So we'll head on to donor gratitude, letting recurring donors know they're appreciated, not just after their first gift, right? There's a whole journey that can go into place here. And, it's my understanding, this is just one piece of this massive puzzle of how do you communicate with your recurring donors? So there's going to be a lot going on here. And before we talk about, hey, what is going on in this automation workflow? We see some like SP acronyms in here. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah. So we were just talking yesterday about acronyms in all of our nonprofits and tech space. We all have our own alphabet of acronyms. So SP for JBMI, this organization is Shalom Partners, which is really the name of the monthly donor program. So it's a recurring giving program. And like you said, for donor appreciation, we wanted to make sure that we didn't just put them through a welcome series, but we also appreciated them at their 1 year mark. And so that's when you see SP, that's just referring to our monthly donor program. And we wanted to make sure we were communicating to them specifically to their needs.
That's awesome. And I think something that is like deeply relatable to a lot of organizations, monthly donor programs can be really impactful, and we can give them all kinds of names that fit best with your organization and your organization's mission, and can really inspire donors to come in and give that monthly donation because they're supporting your cause. So I think this is something that is, again, I wouldn't say completely replicable. Every organization is going to be a little different, of course, but I think something that everyone can pull a nugget or a piece of knowledge away from. So, now that we've talked a little bit about, what is the SP, that's the Shalom Partner Program, what that actually does and what that truly means, can you walk us through in a little more detail what's going on in this workflow? Like we've got tag removals, we got email, voicemail, postcard, things like that. Can we talk a little bit about what's going on in each of these steps?
Yeah, sure. So this might be a little confusing if you don't realize that automations run right to left. That's the way if you ever run the enrollment on it, you'll see that's the order it does it. So in this case, starting from the upper right, we have the tag step, which that looks for people in the criteria, in this case, who have given for almost 12 months. And it goes ahead and tags them to identify them. The next one over, the remove tag, is once they are communicated, that removes the tag. So make sure we're keeping things clean. Then the next step over, we're going to jump down one and go to voicemail. So voicemail, we'll try to send out a voicemail if they have a phone number to them. The next step is email. If they didn't have a phone number or that phone number does not accept voicemail, then it goes to email step if they have an email. If that doesn't work, then it goes down next to the contact queue, which triggers off a note to our partner services team to try and give them a call manually. Maybe they have a secondary phone number, secondary email address we can try. And so they can see if they can get a hold of them. If they have neither an email nor a phone number, then they go straight to a postcard, because we usually have a physical address for them, and that will send out a postcard using the letters on demand system. And then finally, if none of that works, like for example, they have a physical address, but they have a tag on there saying don't mail them, they don't want mail, then I have a fail kind of step in there that just basically says we couldn't contact this person, and then goes ahead and that gets them into the remove tag step again to keep things clean, but also in case someone's looking at their account later going, oh, like why didn't they get contacted? They can see, okay, well, at the time we weren't able to contact them through the automation. So that's a very quick walkthrough. And the reason it's kind of set up that way is we identified for each type of communication, we're kind of going on a cost basis. The voicemails is cheapest, emails next cheapest, postcards the more expensive, and the time of our employees is, so we're kind of going down that line. But the way it's set up, it'd be very easy to swap like the email and phone steps. It'd be easy to swap the other steps around in case we say, oh, we actually want to try email first because we're finding better success with that, or we want to try a postcard first for this specific time period. So that kind of is general gist of it.
Yeah, and that's really exciting because it ties in a little bit of what we talked about before of having some sort of internal data management. So while yes, this is a workflow dedicated to reaching out to donors in a lot of different ways, in some very personal ways, and some some emails, some multi-channel, things like that. But also, right, hey, if we can't reach them in any of these ways, that's still a piece of information that's important to us and something that our team can benefit from. In a way we can manage that data moving forward. So I love that it kind of ties it all together, what we saw in the first workflow versus what we're seeing here. It's kind of cool to see that all together and show this automation approach that, again, lets you manage your internal data, but also allows you to reach your supporters. So I think that's really exciting. And I really love the multi-channel approach that you guys have going on here because we talk about multi-channel a whole lot, right? A lot of ways to reach supporters where they are in the way that makes most sense for them and makes them feel supported. So understanding like there's a lot of multi-channel opportunity here. And you mentioned that like there's a particular strategy you have walking through that, right? Like this is kind of the most expensive to work with. But are there other ways that you've identified like who should qualify for that? Carly, I know we've talked a little bit about criteria before, and Justin was part of this as well about, how do you determine like who gets pulled in? I think, Justin, you made a nugget about that. Like, hey, if you don't want direct mail, like obviously you shouldn't get a direct mail piece. Can you expand a little bit more on essentially like the criteria and how you help identify who goes in which group?
Yes. Sorry, just thinking through. Yeah, so it is down to the data, the various tags we have for who. So we have tags as saw in the first automation for all the different communication types and saying the partner does not want to be communicated in this way. And so that is kind of what I'm using as the basis for whether or not they should be in a communication. So I kind of in this one setup, where it grabs the overall group first of here's people who need to be contacted. And then for each step along the way, it's looking, okay, I have that tag, but do I have a block for that particular type of communication? And then if so, then it just moves it to the next row. Also in that particular one for like the voicemail step, because it can try to send them the voicemail and then might kick back and say, oops, this didn't work because their mailbox is full, not set up, it's a landline. That will trigger another automation that you saw in the first slide to add a tag in real time saying, hey, this voicemail failed, which then actually feeds back into the other automation to say, okay, now they're not valid for this, kick them over to the next one. So we're actually also doing kind of almost real time data management for it as it's going along.
I think that's really interesting too, and something I wanted to dive into a little bit more as well is, right, you've got these different automation workflows, and while they are, separate workflows as we see them in the system, there's clearly interaction between them, and there's some sort of overlap between, okay, if something happens in this automation workflow, that could impact what happens to that person in this automation workflow. So, as part of that, and I understand that these are just two pieces of this wider puzzle that we have here with how you not only manage data, but also manage the journey of Shalom partners in here. So I'm curious to understand, what was the planning process? And we can get as detailed as possible in this one, because I think there are a lot of moving parts here. What was the planning process, and how did you decide to, start this one web and then have this other web, and also realize this web impacts this web in this way? How do you even begin with that?
Yeah, it mainly started from me coming up with ideas and then Justin saying that's not going to work. Yeah. But what I love about this specific automation that we're talking about is it started small and then it grew bigger. So we started with just one tag, it would trigger that someone was a Shalom partner. So we tagged them as a Shalom partner, and that was the whole Shalom partner automation. And then it was hey, we should start acknowledging them. So then we would add the next automation, which is let's acknowledge them at 12 months. Then we started looking into the data and saying some of them start dropping off at 9 months. So now we should do a lapsed, kind of a pre-lapsed acknowledgement. So then we would say, hey, let's see how we can set up a pre-lapsed acknowledgement. And so it was kind of we'd set up the automation, we'd get some data from it, and then we would add or adjust another automation. And then, I would come to Justin and say, here's what we're seeing in the data. How can we adjust this to the automation? And then Justin can tell you the web of issues and how they all related to each other.
Yeah, so what you're looking at grew over the course of about 2 years. So this was not just something that got thrown together. So it did start kind of like Carly said, from very simple, oh, they're a Shalom partner, they're not a Shalom partner, looking at the recurring giving objects. And then it's okay, well, what happens if we reacquire them? What happens to the tags? And what happens if we do this? In the case of the 12-month automation, the 9-month automation, because they work very much the same, it started out as, hey, let's just have our partner services team call them and thank them. And so it was just a straight up oh, they had 12 months, task to partner services, have them call. And then partner services quickly got overwhelmed and said, hey, this is a little bit too much. And so we said, okay, well, we can probably, we'd been experimenting with our voicemail system. And we said, okay, well, we can do that. And instead of having someone actually physically call them, we can record a message and then have that pushed to their voicemail, same effect. And then we're okay, well, people don't have email or voicemail or whatever, so we'll add email to it. And so then it just kind of started moving out as we realized, okay, here's another area that we're currently not covering, let's add it. Here's an area we're not covering, let's add it. And so it kind of just built out organically in that way. And for me, the way I kind of approach this is I start outside of Virtuous, and I just have a scratch, notepad document, whatever, where I start planning out, okay, here's the general flow that I want. Here's the tags that are going to need to be there. Here's the queries. I actually just build it all outside Virtuous so I can see it in one place. And then also if I'm coming back to it later, again, instead of having to pause the automation and click through every step going, what did I do here? What did I do here? I have it all right there. And so I can see the flow pretty easily and know, okay, I can slot this in here. I can make this adjustment. Oops, I'm blocking this up here. And so that helps a lot. If you are familiar with doing flowcharts, if you're a flowchart person, that's a great way to start out and say, here's the path I want this to take through here. And then it becomes just a matter of what's going to get me data-wise to that specific step. And where am I also creating blocks that I don't want to be doing? Do I need to swap 2 steps? Do I need to do whatever like that? And again, just start small and kind of work your way out. And
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think there are a lot of great takeaways that we can really take from not just the first workflow, and not just the second workflow, but also just this whole big picture of workflows that you mentioned, Justin, right? Starting small. You don't have to obviously create all of this all at once today. If you could, that would be really impressive. I'm not going to lie. But like, we don't have to start there yet. There is time. So we can always start small and then kind of work our way up, right? This started as just adding a tag before, and now there's this whole adventure with Shalom Partners. That's what I'm calling it. I'm excited about it. And there's this whole journey that exists now because of this. And like you said, Justin, it seems to happen over like a 2-year period. So it sounds like there's a lot of evolution that happens here, right? So you might find that, hey, we're overwhelming our partner team, for example. Yep. So I think there's definitely that opportunity to, hey, make a few tweaks here and there. And so I think another good takeaway from this is that like this doesn't have to be permanent or the way you do things forever. We believe a whole lot in change, and especially making change as a result of listening. Right? The whole responsive framework is a circle. It is a cycle for that reason. Listen, connect, suggest, and learn. And then start all over again, right? And this is kind of part of that process, right? Reiterating based on information you're finding out with your team internally, based on donor behavior. And I think that's really inspirational to understand that it's not that you have to build this thing and there's high pressure to do it because it has to be that way forever. That can change.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Justin, I really love this point you brought up about planning it before you even build it in the system. Now, this is built in Virtuous, but there are other tools that have automation as well. But I think that that's something that is replicable no matter what tool you're using, right? Just kind of map it out. It does not have to be like anything like really fancy or anything like that. I too am a fan of flowcharts and all technologies that use it, even if it's just, I don't know, drawing on a whiteboard, circles, arrows everywhere. But I think it's good to visualize it first so we can understand, okay, this is happening at this step in the journey, or this thing is happening. Oh, there's a gap here. Maybe we should address that gap with, I don't know, something, another step, another action, or another workflow or anything like that. So I think there is a lot of good kind of like next steps to go on about this. This isn't just something that happens overnight. This isn't something that you're just like, all right, I know what I'm doing. Click, click, click. It's done. It does take a little bit of time, which I know can sound a little daunting sometimes, but it sounds like you're collaborating with team members, you're collaborating with each other, you're collaborating with vendors, you're collaborating with other teams that may not have even touched these workflows. And I think that is also another part of this. It's not just the technical bits, but it's also making sure you're collaborating with people, making sure that people are in the loop about things. So I think that's really awesome. Is there anything else you two would like to share about this, the Shalom Partner journey, or any workflows that we talked about today?
Yeah, I love that you called it a Shalom Partner adventure. I'm just like imagining like a Monopoly board, like a Shalom Partner Monopoly board. But a question I have for you, Justin, is once you start building multiple automations, and now you might be worried like, well, I have the new Welcome Series automation and I have the Shalom Partner automation. How do you make sure that like one person isn't getting like flooded with automatic communications? Is there something that you would use in your flow chart, or how would you like make sure they were opted out of some so they could get the one that they should be getting?
It really depends on which automations are interacting. Like in the case of someone comes in as a Shalom Partner, so they signed up, their first gift to us was a recurring gift. They're going to get the tag right away. And so that's going to block them from the regular Welcome Series and push them to the Shalom Partner Welcome Series. And for that purpose, in the Welcome Series, I might actually put in like a 1-day delay to give the automation time to run and identify them as a Shalom Partner.
I see.
Sometimes I use notes. So I'll set a note in one, as you can see on the last slide. I was setting a lot of notes there to. That's how I was kind of using. That's what I was using to basically say yes, they've been through this automation, and also again later tell people, hey, they received this thing of the automation. So if I'm setting a note, then I might reference that note in another workflow and say, hey, if they have this note, like keep them out. Do the same thing actually for a few of the automations where we're contacting them like every quarter. We set a note and then we say, okay, if a note has been set in the last quarter, then ignore them. And then as soon as we run past that time frame, then they're free for the automation again. So yeah, tags, notes, delays, it really just depends on what it is we're doing. But yeah, it does eventually. You do have to start thinking about how they're interacting together.
Yeah.
So.
And it sounds to me like this is something that also kind of interacts with the approach you've taken of just like mapping it out first, right? Mm-hmm. So then you can identify like, okay, well, maybe I might need to add some extra criteria here to make sure that, you know, they're not getting bombarded with like the same communications or communications that aren't really appropriate for the stage that they're in.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes a really important part of this is, you know, we're not just mapping this out because we feel like it, but it's also just, hey, we're recognizing there are a lot of ways someone could enter this workflow, a lot of things that can happen after they enter that workflow. And how do we accommodate that? How do we accommodate each journey or adventure, as we're now going to start saying? How do we accommodate all of these adventures? And there are ways to do it, just as a matter of understanding where are the different forks in these pathways. Great. That's a fork we're going to focus on now. We're going to incorporate that into our criteria, and then consider that as we start to build out more criteria and ways to make sure they're going in the right place at the right time.
Yep.
And the only other thing I would say is if you're getting started on it, it's okay to test things out. So like I'll also just start building queries in Virtuous and saying, oh, is this getting me the partner list I want? You don't have to jump straight into automation, step one, build the query, do the filter, and then kind of go through that. You can actually just start playing around with the data and making sure that you're getting the results you want before you even start, because that'll often turn up like, oops, I forgot this, I forgot that. Oh, I can actually go at it this way. So yeah, just feel free to play around first with the data before you even start like building out the automation.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I think we all love the opportunity to test something out, test the waters before we really, truly dive in there. And it sounds like, right, in Virtuous, there are lots of ways to do that. In other systems, they typically offer ways to do that as well. So it's not just, all right, I'm going to put this out in the wild. We'll see how it goes. But it's like, okay, let's dip our toes in the water. Oh, that didn't work quite the way I wanted it to. Great. Let's roll that back and let's try this again. I mean, I imagine, did you get it right the first time? I was hoping the answer would be no, because I feel like the answer should be no most of the time.
A lot. So usually what will happen is, I'll test it out, and I'll actually build out the automation. I'll run the enrollment, and then I'll just start going through each step, like randomly clicking through the people and looking at their account and going, okay, is there anything on here that means they should not be in this? Or do I know someone who should be in this who's not? And usually I'll find out like, oops, yeah, I forgot this tag, or oops, I need to swap these two steps because one's blocking the other. So yeah, no, I often will be down to the last whatever, fine tuning and tweaking and realizing things aren't quite the same. And actually that's the other thing is there's no such thing as a perfect automation. There's always going to be people who get missed because data is messy and you can't always accommodate. And maybe someone forgot to add the tag to a partner, or they forgot to do this to a partner, and so they didn't get pulled in. And then you get someone going, hey, why didn't this partner get pulled in this automation? Right. And so just that's, if you're going into thinking, oh, okay, I got to get this perfect and whatever, it's not going to happen. You can get pretty close. And then also I tend to err on the side of I'd rather not have someone in the automation rather than have the wrong person in the automation.
It also sounds like a good opportunity to make sure your team's paying attention,
yes.
Which I think there's some benefit in that. But I don't ask that, just to say like, oh, you didn't get it right the first time. But I want to call that out to let everybody know that if you get it right the first time, first of all, that's incredibly impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's another one of those, like, you built this workflow in a day. Wow, good for you. But also, like, that's totally normal. It is totally normal to have to, hey, maybe this didn't go the way I wanted it to the first time. But again, everything's a learning experience. We don't stop changing or evolving both in ourselves and our processes. This got really deep fast. Sorry, guys. But like, we never stop evolving or changing or anything. And I think that same could be applied to how we approach automation workflows. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're starting off, just know that like, hey, you might look back and make changes later. You can test things out. You shouldn't, I don't want anyone to feel discouraged because, hey, I built this thing and oops, like this didn't happen the way I wanted it to. Like, I think that's to be expected, to be honest, to begin with. So I really love that you've talked about that process really in depth, because I think that can be one of those discouragement points, right? Oh, this didn't go the way I wanted it to. Now I can't do automation.
Yeah.
That's not true at all. That just means you learn something new. We're going to move forward and we're going to make this better. And we're going to keep making this better for 2 years. And I imagine there's probably more to come on this.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh,
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like even now, like 2 years later, but even continuing in the future, and maybe it's been more than 2 years for other workflows in particular, but this is just going to keep going. This is going to keep evolving. So I think this is just really the first step in this Shalom partner adventure, but also everyone's automation adventure. Sorry,
Yeah.
I just tapped your shoulder with my
That's
note card here. So what are there any other, like, just general, like, what are some other next steps or other kinds of pieces of advice we might give to the audience here to, inspire us to really move forward with automation or even overcome certain obstacles in here?
I would say starting with looking at some of the dashboards that Virtuous provides, like the responsive listener, and then you can see like what areas does your fundraising need work, like donor retention, or like that's how we got to the pre-lapsed Shalom partner card. We saw, okay, we have all of these monthly donors. That's awesome. They're not staying on the file. Why is that? Do we need to thank them ahead of time so they feel appreciated? We didn't talk about this, but then we started doing a quarterly letters on demand postcard to give them like impact stories. But it all started back to like analyzing the program and saying, where do we have a gap and how could we fill that with automation? So going back to the dashboards, the responsive listener dashboard, other metrics that I'm sure each of your organizations have, and saying, maybe it's a lapsed donor problem, maybe it's new donors, like what can we focus on? And within the automation part of Virtuous, there are some pre-built automations too. So you can go there and say, do I have a new donor welcome series? Do I have an anniversary series? Like start there and then kind of look at your metrics and say, where do I need to focus and how can I use automation?
Yeah. On the data side for data managers, I know breaking down silos is a big thing with Virtuous, is go to all the teams who are using Virtuous and say, hey, what are you guys doing in here? And see if there's any repetitive tasks that they're doing that you can say, oh, yeah, we can automate that. And again, to the point of even just adding tags or saying, okay, like one of the things I built that's everyone seems to really like is changing org groups, is using a tag to trigger an automation that will remove certain org groups and add other org groups. So it gives, in some cases, the users more control over the org groups as far as that are being assigned to things. And also for data managers now, instead of having to go through and mess with the org groups themselves, you can just basically throw a tag on 100 accounts using bulk actions or the contact tags import and do mass changes. If you're like someone leaves and you need to move their caseload over to someone else or someone, things of that nature. That's things I've found. But yeah, I think asking your teams, like, what do you actually need? And also not even just what do you need, is what are you trying to accomplish? Because it could also be that there's another way to accomplish it using automations that no one's thought of.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah.
A donor experience or a supporter experience, creating that really comes down to like, what are you telling your team members? Are we all like, we're all working towards the same mission, right? That's kind of the idea of orgs, is like you work under the same mission, you have maybe somewhat different goals, but there's certainly got to be a lot of overlap in those goals and ways that systems aren't just for like, hey, I'm just doing this to do new email or a new donors email series, but like you can do other things with that as well. Maybe a new volunteer series or a birthday series, like things that aren't even donor focused, which, those are also helpful. But again, like that's not the only part of that journey. It's all the milestones that happen in between. It's all the team members that interact with them or don't interact with them in some sort of way, but like there's still some sort of data overlap there. So I really love that point you make about like, ask your team, what are your goals? How can we accomplish this in the most efficient way possible? And I think that is the name of the game in automation. Any final thoughts before we close out here?
Just touching on what Justin just said, I love that idea of going to the teams and asking them up front. I think after it's implemented, going back and asking them the feedback, because often we don't get the positive feedback in fundraising. We only hear like when the donor got the wrong mail piece and, when you did the select wrong or whatever. But to go back and say, okay, we implemented that suggestion of, let's just say, thanking the Shalom partner. Can you let us know if you hear any positive feedback? Because when we started implementing the quarterly impact stories and we asked, hey, have you heard anything? Then we would get, oh, this person loved this postcard, or because a lot of that is qualitative. Like they just loved it. You can't pull a report that says, what's the impact of this postcard, especially on those donor gratitude pieces. So you have to go to your donor team and say, can you give us some feedback on this? So then we know whether to adjust the automation or not.
That makes perfect sense too. And who doesn't love just like a little like dopamine boost of like, wow, my work is doing such good right now. And like, it's so good to see that. It's just good for the spirit. But I think again, that just goes back to the whole responsive framework. Listen, connect, suggest, and learn, right? It's a feedback loop. And, we can build based on feedback, whether it's, sometimes negative, but mostly also positive. Like, hey, this is going really well. Let's do a little more here because apparently people really like this.
Yeah,
I love that idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our time here. I'm going to have Jason come back in and close us out.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to awkwardly walk on the stage now in front of everybody.
Keep walking back and
just
forth.
Yeah, exactly. just to keep walking back and forth. I actually need to get, there we go, in frame. Well, thanks guys. That was awesome. Automation, it's such a powerful tool. It can be an incredibly intimidating tool. But hopefully you've learned a few tips. I love this idea of like starting analog, map it out on a whiteboard, talk to your team, draw it out before you even get into the actual automation flow. Many times that can help both define the outcome and then also see if there's any gotchas before they actually become actual gotchas. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for commenting in the chat. That is going to conclude the technology stage for this year's Responsive Nonprofit Summit. Thanks for hanging out with us. Trust that you took some insights and some next steps away for your team.